Hello and welcome back to The City Beneath, a devlog where we are building a roguelite dungeon crawler in vanilla Minecraft. In the last episode, I took you through the design and construction of the forest dungeon. If you haven't seen it, you can click the card right now to go and see how that was done. In this episode, we are going to finish off the forest dungeon for the time being with enemy spawning. So without further ado, let's make some bad guys. The first thing I did was to walk through the dungeon, picking out dark spots for enemies to spawn. I wanted both sides of the dungeon to be balanced with enemies to keep one side from being the quote-unquote obvious path because it was easier. Each spawn location has 2 to 3 enemies that are summoned at a time, but that value can always be tweaked to be easier or harder as playtesting goes on. When I find a spot I want enemies to spawn, I place a block down and get the coordinates for later. I then go into the MC Lantern file that handles enemy summoning for the forest dungeon. MC Lantern is a language I've been writing to make working with MC functions and data packs easier. Essentially, it's just a higher language for MC function that is tuned to how I want to work with it. Here, the process is pretty straightforward, and after doing it a few times, it became pretty quick. First, I create a spawn flag for the enemy group. For this example, we'll be following spawn 1-1, which means spawn flag for dungeon 1, group 1. A spawn flag is just a yes or no to whether the enemy group has spawned in or not on that run. This gets reset every time the dungeon resets. In fact, that's step 2. Add the new flag to the reset trigger. Anything within this reset function gets called when the player respawns. Next, we create the spawn check function that gets run every tick in a command block. This command block is placed under the ground in the area that you want the enemy group summoned from. Usually this is a few blocks away from where the enemy group will actually get summoned in at so the player can see it happen. And at branching pathways like this, I'll have a command block on either side of the summoning point, both running the same command for that point. That way, no matter which direction the player encounters that point from, the enemy group will get summoned. I could have put the command block under where the enemy spawns and set the radius wider, but I found that didn't give me the fine trigger box control I was looking for. When the player triggers the check command, then the spawn command is called. The spawn command first sets the spawn flag to true so that it cannot get called again until the next run after it's reset. After that, it summons the enemy group at the coordinates I copied earlier. And that's it. Now I just rinse and repeat until I feel like every dark area that should be lurking with enemies has their command set up. Next, we're going to add a mini-boss. Adding a mini-boss to the dungeon was pretty similar to adding the normal enemies. I went through the same process of setting up the spawn checks and placing the command block into the entrance of the room. This time, however, I gave the witch 40 points of health. That's double the players, mind you, and altered the death loot table to drop an item that is needed for progressing in the main room. Something else that differs from the main enemies is the boss bar. The boss bar is created and destroyed when the witch spawns and dies. It also gets destroyed when the map resets. It is pretty straightforward and just updates every tick with the health value of the only mob tagged mini boss 1, which in this case is our witch. We move on now to the boss fight for the forest dungeon. Summoning the boss is just like every other entity, except we summon its horse first and specify the real boss as its passenger. This boss has 60 health, so 3 times the player's health, and will drop a special artifact on his death, just like the mini boss. This artifact will get used in the overall story of the map sometime down the road, so I won't go into that too much now. What makes this fight unique is what happens when the boss reaches half health. The zombie then summons 4 skeletal minions to help fight with it. I wanted to emulate the trapped skeleton horse mechanic from vanilla Minecraft, but tweak it a bit. When the skeletal riders are summoned, they don't start in the same block space as each other like a vanilla trap, but rather are spread out surrounding the podium. These riders also don't have bow and arrows like normal skeletons do, and need to get close to punch you. I felt the difficulty was a little too high with bows, so the player now has a fighting chance. This is the first dungeon, and we have plenty of chances to really challenge the player in future dungeons. Some small things to note are that the skeletons are summoned with fire resistance, because I also built in the lightning strike when they get summoned, and it kept setting them on fire and killing them. Another thing to mention is that the normal enemies in this map drop bits, which are iron nuggets. These minions, however, drop bytes, which are gold nuggets and will be worth more outside of the dungeon, if the player survives. The last thing to mention is that once the player kills the boss, the minions are killed automatically. I felt there was no advantage to making the player kill the underlings after the most difficult enemy in the room was already dead. After all, the boss is really why they're here. Finally, after the boss is defeated, the podium breaks apart and reveals a strange stone in its center. Jumping onto this stone teleports the player safely out of the dungeon and back to the cavern where they can enjoy their bounty and prepare for the next dungeon. And that's mostly it for enemy spawning mechanics of the forest dungeon. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you soon with the next devlog. But until then, so long.